Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dark Domain. Now I know a lot of you these videos to sleep. So before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea. If everyone could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episode. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed and let's. In the gray sprawl of a dying Midwestern town, where cornfields stretched into a horizon choked with dust, a farmer named Amos tilled an overgrown patch of land he'd ignored for decades. His plow snagged on something hard, unearthing not roots but a tangle of human bones, femurs, ribs, skulls gleaming white under the weak October sun. They dangled from the gnarled branches of an orchard he didn't remember planting, swaying like grotesque fruit in the wind. The townsfolk, hollow-eyed and superstitious, muttered about the Dust Bowl days when desperate settlers made pacts with things older than the soil. Amos didn't listen. He saw only profit, frying the bones free and stacking them in his barn, their surfaces oddly warm to the touch, as if still alive. The air around the orchard carried a faint hum, low and insistent, rising from the earth like a heartbeat too slow to be human, though Amos dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on his tired mind. Weeks passed, and the town withered into an eerie stillness, its streets empty save for the buyers who lingered near the orchard, their skin graying, splitting at the joints to reveal bones beneath not their own, but older, pitted with age and stained yellow. The trees shuddered without wind, shedding femurs and spines that sank into the soil, only to re-emerge hours later, woven into the branches like a macabre harvest. Amos barricaded himself in his farmhouse, clutching a skull he'd kept for himself, its eye sockets seeming to widen each time he looked away. The hum became a roar, shaking the windows, and the air thickened with a stench of rot and wet earth, pressing against his lungs. Outside, the figures clawed at the ground, unearthing shallow pits filled with rags and dust, their bodies unraveling into skeletal husks that stood upright, swaying as if caught in a storm only they could feel. The skull in his hands cracked open, spilling a black, oily sap that burned his palms, and the floorboards buckled as roots pale and vein pushed upward, tasting the air. Darkness cloaked the town as the orchard glowed, a sickly phosphorescence pulsing from the bones, illuminating the skeletal figures that pressed against Amos's house, their fingerless hands scraping the walls until splinters rained down. They wore tatters of Dust Bowl cloth bonnets, overalls clinging to frames that shouldn't move, their skulls tilted back in silent, gaping howls. The roots breached the house, coiling around furniture, shattering glass, and Amos stumbled to the attic, his breath ragged, the skull still clutched to his chest as its sap dripped onto the floor, sizzling like acid. The hum was deafening now, a chorus of the damned rising from the earth, and the trees outside bent inward, their branches piercing the roof, curling toward him with deliberate malice. The figures climbed the walls, their bones clattering like wind chimes, and the air grew heavy with dust that stung his eyes, dust that carried the faint outline of faces settlers long dead, their pact with the soil now claiming its price. The roots found his ankles, tightening, and the skull pulsed in rhythm with his heart, as if it knew him. The house groaned its last as the orchard consumed it, roots dragging Amos downward through splintered floors, his skin tearing as branches speared his flesh, threading through muscle and bone with surgical precision. The skeletal figures swarmed, their empty sockets fixed on him, and the trees hoisted him into their canopy, his body splitting apart as his bones still wet, still red joined the harvest, whitening in seconds under a sky that offered no stars. The town dissolved into the orchard's grasp, fields and homes swallowed by a sprawling grove that stretched beyond sight, its branches laden with skeletons, hundreds, thousands, their skulls locked in eternal screams, swaying as one. Beneath the soil, the hum softened to a wet, rhythmic chewing, an ancient thing savoring its feast, its roots curling deeper, waiting for the next plow to break the surface. Amos's skull hung highest, its jaw unhinged, dripping black sap that pooled below, a beacon for whatever came next. In a forgotten corner of a Midwestern town, where the wine carried dust older than memory, Amos stumbled upon an orchard hidden behind a wall of dead corn stalks, its trees twisted and bare under a sky the color of ash. His shovel struck something solid, not stone but bone, a skull staring up through the soil, its sockets deep and accusing, followed by ribs and spines tangled in the roots. The trees above bore more, their branches sagging with skeletal remains that gleamed faintly, swaying as if caught in a breath the air didn't hold. The townsfolk avoided this place, their grandmothers' tales warning of a hunger buried during the Dust Bowl, a pact sealed in desperation. Amos felt no fear, only greed, hauling the bones to his shed under the cover of dusk, their warmth seeping into his palms like a living thing. The ground beneath the orchard pulsed faintly, a rhythm to slow, to deep, and noticed by his calloused hands. Word spread fast Amos was selling miracle relics from his bone orchard, claiming they healed aches, banished bad dreams, brought luck. The townsfolk came, clutching crumpled dollars, their faces gaunt with hope, taking femurs and vertebrae wrapped in burlap. At night, Amos noticed the orchard shifting, trees creaking without wine, new bones budding from the branches like pale blossoms. He ignored the whispers in his sleep, faint and guttural, urging him to dig deeper. By week's end, the buyers returned, not with thanks but with strange stillness, skin stretched tight over their bones, eyes sunken, fingers curling like roots, as if something inside them was waking up. The shed grew humid, the bones stacked within humming softly, a sound that echoed the orchard's pulse. The town dimmed as autumn bled into a perpetual twilight, its edges softening under a haze that smelled of damp earth and decay. The buyers lingered near the orchard, their bodies bending unnaturally, joints cracking as their skin peeled back to reveal bones beneath older, pitted, not theirs. The trees swelled, their bark splitting to release a flood of skeletal fragments that littered the ground, only to climb back into the branches by dawn, guided by tendrils of root that slithered like veins. Amos locked his doors, the whispers now a chorus clawing at his mind, but he couldn't part with the femur he kept, its heat a comfort against the chill seeping through the walls. The townsfolk's shadows stretched to lawn, merging with the orchards, and the pulse grew louder, shaking the earth, calling something upward. Night fell heavy, the orchard glowing with a sickly light that seeped from the bones, casting jagged shadows across Amos's crumbling farmhouse. Figures emerged from the soil skeletal, draped in rags of faded calico and denim, their movements jerky as if pulled by unseen strings, their skulls tilted toward the sky. The trees bent low, branches curling toward the house, piercing the walls with a sound like snapping bones, while the roots erupted indoors, pale and slick, wrapping around beams and chairs. Amos fled to the attic, the femur clutched tight, its surface now slick with black ooze that stung his flesh, and the air filled with dust that carried faint, fleeting shapes, faces of the lost, mouths wide in silent pleas. The skeletal figures pressed closer, their bony hands clawing at the roof, and the pulse became a roar, a hunger given form. The farmhouse shuddered and collapsed as the orchard claimed it, roots dragging Amos through the wreckage, his skin snagging on branches that pierced him, pulling his bones free while he still breathed. The skeletal figures swarmed, their empty sockets unblinking, and the trees lifted him high, his body unraveling into the canopy, his skull joining the harvest, dripping dark sap that fed the soil below. The town vanished, swallowed by an orchard that sprawled endlessly, its branches heavy with skeletons countless, swaying, their jaws locked in eternal howls under a sky that refused to lighten. Beneath, the pulse softened to a wet, rhythmic churn, an ancient presence sated, its roots sinking deeper, waiting for the next to unearth its bounty. Amos's skull hung highest, eyeless, a silent sentinel over a grove that breathed. In a windswept Midwestern town where the soil cracked like old skin, Amos wandered into an overgrown thicket he'd never bothered to clear, its trees skeletal and hunched under a sky heavy with gray. His boots sank into something soft, then struck bone femur protruding from the dirt, followed by a ribcage coiled in roots, all dangling from branches above like forgotten ornaments. The orchard shimmered with an odd sheen, the bones swaying without breeze, their surfaces smooth and warm as if freshly pulled from flesh. The townsfolk, their eyes shadowed with old fears, spoke of Dust Bowl curses, of settlers who traded souls for rain. But Amos saw only treasure, prying the bones loose and carting them to his shed. The earth beneath pulsed faintly, a tremor too subtle to name, ignored as he stacked his haul under the flickering light of a storm lamp. Amos turned the bones into a grim trade, polishing them until they gleamed, selling them as holy relics to townsfolk who arrived with pinched faces and whispered hope's cures for pain, promises of sleep. They left with vertebrae and skulls wrapped in cloth, their steps slow, their shadows stretching thin across the dusty road. At night, the orchard stirred, its trees groaning as new bones pushed through the bark like pale buds, glistening under a moon that refused to rise. Amos shrugged off the low murmurs that haunted his dreams, urging him to dig, to give more, his hands tracing the contours of a kept rib that burned against his skin. The shed grew stifling, the stacked bones humming a tune that matched the orchard's rhythm, unnoticed as he counted his coins. The town grew quiet. To quiet no dogs barked, no children laughed. Amos woke to find his buyers standing in the orchard at dawn, motionless, staring at the trees with mouths agape. Their skin split along the seams, revealing brittle, yellowed bones beneath, not theirs but older, as if borrowed from the earth. The air thickened with a sour stench, and the trees trembled, shedding more bones that clattered to the ground like hail. Amos locked his doors, but the whispers turned to moans, seeping through the walls, and his hands shook as he clutched a rib he hadn't sold its warmth, now a pulsing heat that matched his heartbeat. Outside, the figures began to claw at the soil, unearthing shallow graves he'd never seen before. Darkness draped the town, the orchard glowing with a faint, jaundiced light that pulsed from its laden branches, illuminating figures clawing free from the grave skeletons in tattered homespun, their movements jagged, skulls lolling as if listening to the moans now shaking the air. The trees bent inward, their roots bursting through Amos's floorboards, pale and slick, snaking toward him as he stumbled to the cellar, the rib in his grip oozing a dark, bitter sap that stung his flesh. The skeletal forms pressed against the house, their bony fingers scraping wood to dust, and the air grew thick with swirling motes that shaped into fleeting, anguished faces, echoes of the past. Bound to the soil, the pulse roared, a drumbeat from below, and the orchard seemed to breathe, its hunger palpable. The house buckled as the orchard devoured it, roots coiling around Amos's legs, dragging him upward through shattered beams, his body snagging on branches that tore him apart, claiming his bones while his breath still rasped. The skeletal figures gathered beneath, their eyeless gazes fixed as the trees hoisted him into their canopy, his skull snapping free to join the harvest, dripping sap that fed a ground now rippling with life. The town dissolved into the orchard sprawl, an endless grove of bone-laden trees stretching beneath a void sky, their skeletal fruit swaying in unison, jaws wide in silent screams. The pulse below softened to a wet, contented churn, an ancient entity sated, its roots curling deeper, patient for the next trespasser. Amos's skull gleamed atop the tallest tree, a hollow crown over a feast without end. In a desolate Midwestern town where the wind howled through fields of brittle corn, Amos hacked at a neglected patch of land, and covering an orchard of twisted trees he swore hadn't been there before, their branches laden with bone skulls, ribs, spines glistening under a pallid sun. The soil yielded more as he dug, revealing skeletal remains tangled in roots, their surfaces warm and smooth as if freshly stripped. The townsfolk, their faces etched with dread, whispered of dust-bowl days when starvation drove settlers to unholy bargains, but Amos saw only riches, hauling the bones to his barn under a sky that seemed to sag. The air carried a faint hum, low and mournful, rising from the earth, unnoticed as he stacked his find, their warmth lingering on his hands like a stain. Amos polished the bones until they shone, peddling them as sacred relics to the townsfolk, who arrived with hollow eyes and trembling hands, trading coins for promises of healing and peace. They carried away femurs and clavicles in burlap sacks, their footsteps dragging as if the weight grew heavier with each step. At night, the orchard shifted, its trees creaking as new bones sprouted from the bark, pale and wet, bending the branches low. Amos ignored the murmurs that slipped into his sleep, urging him to unearth more, his fingers tracing a kept rib that pulsed faintly against his palm. The barn grew stifling, the stacked bones humming a tune that echoed the orchard's rhythm, a sound he dismissed as the settling of old wood. The town fell silent, its life drained away. No birds sang, no wind stirred. Amos woke to find his buyers standing in the orchard at dawn, their bodies rigid, eyes sunken into skulls as their skin tightened, then split, revealing ancient, yellowed bones beneath, not theirs but borrowed from time. The trees quivered, shedding skeletal fragments that piled at their bases, only to rise back upward by dust, guided by roots that pulsed beneath the soil. Amos bolted his doors, the murmurs turning to wails that pierced the walls, the rib in his grip now a burning coal against his flesh. The air thickened with a rancid odor, and the figures clawed at the earth, unearthing shallow pits that yawned like wounds, their edges crumbling under an unseen weight. Night fell, and the orchard glowed faintly, a sickly yellow light pulsing from the tree's marrow. Amos peered through his window, heart hammering, as the figures now dozens shambled from the graves, their flesh sloughing off to reveal skeletons wrapped in tattered Dust Bowl rags. They weren't his neighbors anymore. They were older, eyeless, their jaws unhinged in silent screams. The bones he'd sold had called them back, and they pressed against his house, splintering wood, their bony fingers scraping like knives. The rib in his hand throbbed, splitting open to reveal a hollow leaking black sap that burned his skin, and the walls shuddered as the orchard itself groaned, roots erupting through his floorboards. The house collapsed inward as the orchard surged, roots snaking around Amos's limbs, dragging him through the wreckage, his flesh tearing as branches pierced him, wrenching his bones free while his screams choked on dust. The skeletal ghosts swarmed, their hollow sockets fixed on him, and the trees lifted him into their embrace, his skull snapping loose to join the canopy, dripping black sap that soaked the soil below. The town vanished, consumed by an orchard that sprawled beyond the horizon, its branches heavy with skeletons, hundreds, their jaws locked in eternal howls, swaying under a starless void. The hum beneath softened to a slow, wet chewing, an ancient force satisfied, its roots curling deeper, waiting for the next to disturb its rest. Amos's skull hung highest, a dark beacon glistening in the endless grove. In a forsaken Midwestern town where dust clung to every breath, Amos tilled a forgotten corner of his land, his plow catching on something unyielding, not rock, but bone, a skull grinning up from the soil, followed by ribs and femurs dangling from the branches of an orchard he didn't recall. The trees stood gnarled and bare, their skeletal fruit swaying gently under a sky drained of color, each bone warm to the touch as if reluctant to cool. The townsfolk, their voices hushed with old dread, spoke of Dust Bowl packs, of settlers who begged the earth for mercy and paid with more than blood, but Amos saw only gain, gathering the bones into his barn. The ground beneath pulsed faintly, a rhythm too deep to hear, ignored as he stacked his haul under the dim glow of a lantern. Amos turned the bones into a dark commerce, rubbing them smooth and selling them as miracle relics to the townsfolk, who shuffled forward with sunken eyes and desperate hands, trading crumpled bills for promises of relief. They left with spines and knuckles wrapped in burlap, their steps growing sluggish, their shadows thinning against the cracked earth. At night, the orchard stirred, its trees creaking as new bones pushed through the bark like pale blossoms, their surfaces slick under a moonless sky. Amos brushed off the whispers that crept into his dreams, low and insistent, urging him to dig deeper, his fingers lingering on a rib he kept, its warmth a quiet pulse. The barn grew heavy with a hum, the bones resonating with the orchard's unseen heartbeat, and noticed as he counted his profits. The town faded into silence, its life leached away, no wind rustled, no voices called. Amos woke to find his buyers gathered in the orchard at dawn, their bodies still, mouths gaping as their skin stretched taut, then tore, revealing ancient, brittle bones beneath, not theirs but stolen from time. The trees shuddered, shedding skeletal shards that littered the ground like fallen fruit, only to ride back into the branches by dusk, guided by roots that throbbed below. Amos barred his doors, the whispers now moaned seeping through the walls, the rib in his grip burning hotter, sensing with his pulse. The air grew sour, and the figures clawed at the soil, unearthing shallow graves that split the earth like scars, their edges trembling with something alive. Night cloaked the town in shadow, the orchard glowing with a faint, sickly light pulsing from its marrow-laden branches, casting jagged silhouettes across Amos's trembling house. Figures rose from the graves, dozens, their flesh peeling away to reveal skeletons draped in tattered Dust Bowl cloth, eyeless, jaws unhinged in silent wails, summoned by the bones he'd sold. They pressed against the walls, splintering wood with bony hands, their scraping a chorus of knives, while the trees groaned, roots bursting through the floorboards, pale and slick. Amos clutched the rib, its heat splitting it open, black sap oozing out to sear his skin, and the house quaked as the orchard's hunger surged, reaching for him. The air thickened with dust, swirling into faint, anguished faces echoes of the den, bound to the soil. Amos fled to the cellar, but the roots followed, coiling around his legs, dragging him upward through the house as it collapsed into the orchard's embrace. The skeletal figures swarmed, their empty sockets fixed on him, and the trees bent low, branches piercing his flesh, threading through his veins. His screams choked off as his bones snapped free, rising to join the canopy, glistening wet and red before whitening under an unseen moon. The town vanished that night, swallowed by an orchard that stretched for miles, its fruit swaying hundreds of human skeletons, their skulls tilted skyward, jaws wide in a final, endless howl. Beneath the soil, something ancient chewed softly, satisfied at last.